when I think about being an ally, I also think about it for people that were allies for me. Uh, but I think, there's some such powerful language about what being an ally is. And ultimately, I think it's about taking action. It's easy to say the words, I am an ally, I am supportive, but ultimately being an ally is standing up and as much as possible to take on the problems and the challenges and the issues of those that have been oppressed. And so being an ally is difficult. There's the politically correct statement of, yes, I'm an ally. And then there's the real work of creating outcomes and not just activity.
I totally agree. And thank you for that, Denise. Pat, I'm going to turn to you. Really being an ally, obviously just listening to some of what Denise was talking about, it obviously means that you may not 100% understand or know what it feels like to be a member of a marginalized community. And so it may also often look like taking other people's struggles as your own by increasing awareness of our own interactions and modeling the kinds of behavior within majority communities or different communities. As somebody who spent a lot of his own time advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, but especially in the public relations industry, what has allyship meant for you, and what is some of your work as you've attempted to show up as an ally for different communities?
Thank you. And I would build on some of the points that Denise made. To me, what we're really talking about is whether you're sort of an interested observer or if you are an actor, if you are being proactive and taking some level of responsibility and showing that you care. So in other words, for me, it's always in so many different ways trying to remember that it's not just a transactional thing, like what am I going to get out of this interaction or this relationship or this mentoring. To me, the ideal approach is to recognize that and don't pretend that you understand, and don't try and convince everybody that you understand, and instead listen and absorb and empathize. So we're going to go through over the course of this discussion a lot of keywords. I would say one of the keywords to start this discussion with is that word empathy and emotional intelligence, and being conscious of perhaps, and even not only being willing to tolerate and or be interested in, but actually to celebrate and want to know more about what you don't know and what you don't understand, and what effect that has and what effect you have. And then the other point I would just make as a starting point is it also means converting that intentionality and that empathy into action. And I've been blessed over the years with some great mentors, and one of them, I heard somebody say something really interesting about him, which was he said, 30 years ago, this person put his arm around me and he never let go. And ever since I've heard that, I've just tried to build as much of a base of individuals who even if I hadn't talked to them for a while, they knew I was thinking of them. And every once in a while, and I do a lot of this now, I just try to reach out and say, thinking about you, everything going okay, and start another conversation, because sometimes it's just that, it's just showing that you care.
I would certainly agree there. I'm muting and unmuting because I've got a little background noise happening in my work from home situation.
We saw those cute kids and the dog. So, yeah.
But I think you raised such a good point, Pat, about how that manifests throughout your life and what people can and should do. Denise, you've held a number of roles, obviously advanced and had a very successful career at Johnson & Johnson. You sit on boards, you're an entrepreneur as well. As we think about the concept of allyship, has, at least for you personally, has your concept or your view of that evolved or changed throughout the course of your professional career? Has it changed how you show up as an ally or for allies in your own life?
Yes, because I think the older and the more senior roles and opportunities that that I've been able to take on, and grateful for that. Also knowing that I think there's a responsibility that I have felt that I need to pay it forward. And I think about all these career angels that I had that made opportunities possible. So some things for me it's about action. I actually created something called the Mentoring Place. Anyone that's listening to it can go to it. It's www.thementoringplace.com. It's a nonprofit organization. It's free, and what we do is connect women with executives so that they can have free mentorship for 12 weeks. And so we're on our third class now. It's been going great. And so part of it is to connect because mentorship is so important, and even more so sponsorship. And so I'm passionate about connecting others. And I really also try to identify during the course of a year, like 1 or 2 people that I can create an internship for that maybe wouldn't have had a possibility, catch a break. And I saw this thing just this morning, when I was reading an article, and I've never heard this before. I've heard all kind of analogies, but this analogy said that when you're an ally, you have to be willing to bunt. And so for people that know baseball, so the bunt, like, people don't want to go up and it's, you take the bat and, it's a slight tap of the ball and, you're just trying to hit a single there. But what this article said is that in order to be an effective ally, you actually have to sacrifice, which is really what doing a bunt is. That it's not about doing things when it's convenient. Although, listen, take any help that we can get, right? But I think being an ally is hard. It's hard work, and I think putting ourselves out there. So the answer to your question is, as I've gotten older, certainly more experience, I actually have less tolerance for talk, and even with myself, I find myself that it's sometimes a challenge to talk in a way that I'm talking at people. It's very uncomfortable to do that versus saying, well, here's what I'm doing. Hope maybe that will inspire others to do something different or much bigger.
Can I jump on that, Alicia?
Yeah.
Because Denise, you have so much company in that feeling, because it happens I've had an occasion to speak with a lot of leaders in our field over the past 2 years as we've been pulling together this Diversity Action Alliance and asking them what is most important now. And we've been talking about this for decades.
Yes.
And we still have a long way to go in many fronts. And I can tell you virtually to a person that, and some of whom initially, in fact, really didn't want to get involved because they said, you know what, I've been to enough conferences. I've been to too many conferences. I don't want to have another conversation about the importance of diversity or this or that. Just take the action. Just make the hires. Just make the promotions. Just build a more belonging environment. And so I think that's part of what gives me optimism, is that we've moved past where I thought things were 20 or 25 years ago, where it was just ignorance and or malice. I don't think it was that much malice. It was ignorance or benign neglect and a sense that, well, when the time comes, or if we have the right candidates, of course we'll make the hire. But it was certainly a lot of denial about what the problem was, and at least more in the past couple of years, and especially these past couple of months, there's more recognition that it is that we do need, and in fact, it's a critical problem, and we need to figure out what converts that to action. So some of that is just leaders leading and committing to action, committing to accelerating their hires, but also it's not just about hiring. It's about building a culture, and that's a lot more difficult than just swiping the pen on a job offer. And so I hope over these next couple of years we're going to see more of that combination of frustration and patience, but also eagerness to just get it, get moving with it. That's kind of what we built this Action Alliance around, for which we now have like 300 leaders in our field that have signed on to
That's
that commitment.
great.
Which is great. Some of what I'm hearing you talk about is, again, what people often say, it's not just diversity, it's about inclusion, right? So you've got to get the people in the door, but then once they're there, what are you doing to ensure that they feel like they have a place to be, a safe space where they belong? So what are the head nods and the cues to help people who may be diverse in whatever dimension of diversity understand that they belong in that place? Yeah. And allies play a huge role in that. One of the things that I think about, and I know we talked about, it's not just talk, it's also action, but it's particularly in this moment, even speaking up is an action that matters, where people's silence can be perceived as not being supportive. So allyship, can show up in so many different ways, but it also requires a sense of vulnerability. I think, when you are the lone voice speaking up for or against an action or a concept in a room, that does require some courage, which provides the room for mistakes. So, we think about, there are a lot of rules to sort of inclusion and being a good ally or a good advocate. So what would you recommend, or what would you suggest to somebody to help them not fall victim to making some of those mistakes around inclusion or being an ally, even when they're incredibly well-intentioned, but they just perhaps, may have said the wrong thing, or, may not have been enlightened? Or should we just expect that people are going to make mistakes if they're going to do this work?
There was this other article that I read that said, looking at companies that start to do more work in the inclusion and diversity space. And it's interesting, right? Because we would often just, a couple words about inclusion and diversity, we, would say D&I, it's D&I, and really it's I&D. Because if we don't create inclusive environments, diversity, first of all, we're not going to seek it out. And secondly, it's not going to thrive. And so job one is creating that safety and creating trusting relationships and openness. And sometimes we would have used the word tolerance, and that's one I'd call BS on. We're not asking people to tolerate, you're right? It's the idea of, and it's not even acceptance, it's seeking out. If we, and this has been the great thing for me about being a business leader, is that I know that diversity drives better business results. And if we, if we're enlightened to that, then we should all be seeking out these different ideas and thoughts and approaches, which do come with how we grew up. And, if we're Hispanic, or, we're Black, or we're Black and we're LGBTQ, I mean, it's a whole mix of things. So I think, to me, that is, that's job one, is around inclusion. The second piece that I was getting to is that I was reading this another article that talked about when you're in companies, that one of the most effective things that we can start off initiatives and continue initiatives is to acknowledge that it's hard. Because when we say, oh gosh, well, let's just do it, what's everyone waiting for? But the reality is, it is hard. Sometimes we trip over our words. Sometimes we say things that, oh, that's not really what I meant. And, and then is there judgment along with that? So that you used such a key word, which is trust, openness, and vulnerability. And, those words allow us to have a dialogue that is more about listening and asking questions in a genuine way. So I think, you know, I think you've said it very well about, you know, the importance of vulnerability and being able to have a dialogue, because sometimes we do inadvertently step in it. And that, you know, there's the times when, right, when you're like, whoa, that was, you know, a microaggression, or that was unconscious bias, or that was just ignorance. And then there's some times where something just came out the wrong way, or an action, if you could do it all over again, you would think like, oh, that just didn't come out the way that I wanted to.
Right, right. And it happens to the best of us, right? And it's, you know, how do we create the environment where it's a conversation that I have frequently, is how do you create the environment where people are free and open to learn,
Yes.
make mistakes?
Yes.
And there's a huge mistakes between the egregious mistakes
Yes.
that involve and the ones that are just innocent because people are just, they don't know, or they're learning, or they're really well intentioned, and there's an opportunity for them to grow and learn, right?
Yes. And some things may be somewhat offensive to someone, and then, but other people go like, no, that's not what they meant. And
Yeah.
it's like I was saying, that thing of being hard. It's hard, and being able to talk about it.
Yeah, it's definitely hard work.
And the other part is being committed and authentic. So so part of, you know, the issue is over in the fullness of time, are you communicating adequately, and communicating in the broadest sense, in other words, and listening, and I think, you know, demonstrating that you don't see your role as helping that person turn themselves into what everybody else looks like or sounds like, or comes across as, but instead helping them to see that and coming to yourself to appreciate that their perspective is not only really interesting for the breadth of thinking that you're going to do in your business, but B, to Denise's point, just better business. You're going to be better able to analyze, assess, and act on opportunities. And we see many, many examples of that out in the business world. And so I think that notion of converting your own mindset as an organization, I'm talking about, and as managers and as leaders, into a genuine desire to bring out the full potential of your organization, which can only happen if there's a diversity of ideas and cultures and insights. And I will tell you that for me, some of that really gelled in my mind when I took on a role of leading an international region for the firm I used to work, because you can't operate, and I ran Asia Pacific. So we had 18 offices and 11 affiliates spread around Asia and other parts of that region. And you can't try and manage one homogenous business there. You can't possibly. And you come to see the benefit of not trying to do that, but instead doing what you can to bring out the strengths of each of those individual cultures and that mix. And that's really what leads to the most successful global businesses as well.
Yeah. Since we're talking about this business, I want to talk a little bit about performative allyship. For people who may not know what that is, it's really when somebody from a non-marginalized group sort of professes solidarity with that group in a way that isn't helpful or could actively harm that group. And it's really more about, it's a shallow display rather than a sincere act of allyship. So, you know, a recent example being, you know, I think following George Floyd, lots of big brands put their black box on their social media platforms. But when you really take a close look, they weren't doing anything to truly advance inclusion or racial equity. Folks that tag on a rainbow and, you know, in some place, but they don't actively embrace, you know, people who are LGBTQ. So I'm going to throw this out to both of you. You know, if you have any experience with performative allyship, I know we've seen numerous examples in the news, as you've mentioned, Pat. But how do people and their organizations help to ward against falling into this kind of a trap?
You know, I think that we've all have seen it, and I think there's some good intent there, but to your point, it is damaging, because saying one thing and then nothing comes, if something doesn't come with it, that the employees at a minimum are thinking, what are you saying, right? Like, I don't see any, you know, you're not walking the talk. And so it does, you know, have, it does two things. It erodes, I think, the trust in the organization. And it's also very, you know, negative to employees that might be, and customers that might be within that organization. And I also think that if we flip it around and say, well, gosh, what are some companies that actually have, you know, put statements out and they're doing things with it? And then you could see the positives of that. I mean, work for Johnson & Johnson. It's taken so many, you know, different steps, and acknowledges, you know, we have work to do, but it makes me proud, you know, as a retiree to see that, because I see the, you know, the change and the movement, and we're not there yet. But to your point, I do, and I think that's why I'm also sensitive of talking at people.
Yeah.
And I find that very offensive, and I really don't want to be that person, that know-it-all, that if you just did this, like, you know, I don't have all the answers. All I can do is my part, you know, and keep challenging myself. Is that enough? But
Yeah.
And you know, over the years, I've worked a lot with companies on issues in crisis management and on corporate reputation. And if there's something you learn in that process, it's that people have an amazing capacity to accept that stuff happens. Mistakes get made, missteps get made, you know, sometimes well-intentioned, sometimes otherwise, but you make a mistake. People will understand that. What they have zero tolerance for is being manipulated or stonewalled or lied to or gaslighted. And I think that's some of what you see there is partially related to that. It's if a company's behavior, we in my corporate reputation class, I use a formula. Reputation, R equals P plus B plus C times AF. And so P is performance, B is behavior. So are you delivering on what you say you're going to be doing? B is, are you behaving ethically and honestly and transparently and interactively? C, communications, are you listening to your stakeholders? But then the multiplier effect is AF, which is not the AF that comes immediately to my students' minds. It's the AF that's authenticity factor. So is this real? In other words, I've got to say, Denise, having observed and then worked at different points in my career with people at Johnson & Johnson on some significant issues where I've seen them take paths that cost them more money because to do otherwise would be contrary to their credo. I think you have good reason to feel proud about being an alum of Johnson & Johnson. And I think, you know, that we see more. We've seen the Business Roundtable a little over a year ago come out with a kind of a remarkable statement if they live up to it. And there's still that big if, and they've got a lot of tests these days. But where they said, we CEOs, we the Business Roundtable that represents CEOs, we recognize that our mission is about more than the primacy of shareholders. No, it's not just about where we get the money and providing profits to them. As one brilliant academic said, if you think that the purpose of business is just to make profits, then that's like saying that you need to have, of course you have to have profits, but if you're a person, you need to have red blood cells. Does that mean that the purpose of life is producing red blood cells? Of course not. What do we think of? What do we all think of? We think about that fire we have about wanting to accomplish this or do something with our family or do something in our career. And of course money is important, but it's never just that. And I think if stakeholders or if the communities where, and particularly underrepresented or marginalized communities, feel that some company that's been contributing to that marginalization, or at least not helping, is out there now acting like, and thumping their chest or posting platitudes, it not only doesn't help, it hurts. It actually makes them more frustrated. And I think you've got to, if you're a business, you've got to be thinking about that, not only from whether that's really helping you with, with your financially related stakeholders, but is it making your employees, is it making someone feel like, I'm glad I work at that company, I'm proud to have been with that company. And where it really works is when you have people whose family members are saying, I'm so proud that Denise was associated with that company. And so I think that that test comes up every day. And yes, there are going to be misstatements, but the question is, are you demonstrating a sustained commitment to addressing and creating opportunities for various parts of your community? And I think that's the real benefit and goal of allyship.
Right. And, so we're talking a little bit about corporations, right? And corporations are huge entities, but they're made up of people. And so it's the micro decisions that people make every day. So whether or not they choose to leave all the seasoned professionals out of the room when they're having a conversation about digital strategy, or if they choose to not have any women in the room as they're talking about how to celebrate Women's History Month, right? So it's those micro decisions and having someone who can tap you on the shoulder to bring you in. And that becomes the connective tissue that creates the culture, that creates the inclusion, that creates the fabric that makes a place like J&J, or a plug for my own employer, Prudential, a place that you want to show up and say, there's somebody here that has my back, that understands that there are various points of view. I think when we think about corporations, though, and allyship, we can, and I know I had this sort of misnomer as a younger professional, that I sort of conflated this idea of allyship, mentorship, sponsorship. Denise, you mentioned those concepts a little earlier. And I've learned, and I always thought that those needed to come from people who were more senior than me. And I've learned through a lot of living that some of my best allies have been peers, or even those that are more junior, because they have access to rooms where I may not be, or they're able to help me with a different perspective, or at least advocate for me as either a professional, a person of color, a woman, or all of the above, right? In your experience, where does some of the most meaningful allyship come from? Is it from, or more senior, should you really look for it there? Is it from people who are your peers or those that are more junior? People like, can you get allyship from, people that only kind of on the periphery, or you have to know somebody super well to be an ally?
Mm-hmm. I love that, the idea of having mentors, who also can be, allies, and mentorship. Sometimes we define it as one thing, like, hey, we're working with this person, in a formal program. And the reality is, mentorship can be advice on one thing. It could be technical. It could be, hey, how do people actually, write emails here? Like, I don't get the style. Like, do people actually answer their emails? And so those unwritten rules.
Mm.
But also at the same time, there is absolutely no substitute for what you know referred to as sponsorship. And so sponsorship is when you're not in the room, and what happens, who's speaking up, who is pulling you up. And without that, it is, you know, we could work our butts off, right? We could do 24-hour a day work days, and that will not, you know, guarantee at all success. And I think that's something too, is like embracing the reality of, you know, how do people get ahead? And, you know, first of all, there's the human nature. We like people like ourselves, so we have to fight human nature. And, you know, the better leaders know that if they surround themselves with individuals that aren't like them, they're going to get better outcomes. But, you know, just, you know, to go back to your point, sponsorship and that ability to connect. And I was on a panel yesterday, and one woman said, well, gosh, you know what, I actually, you know, sponsor, you don't go to sponsors sometimes come to you. And I think there's some truth in that, but I have to say my own experience was I knocked down a lot of doors, and I didn't figure that out until I was in my 40s, that, oh my gosh, right? People aren't coming here. Like, you might get lucky once in a while, but I was like, oh no, I got to go knock on these doors. I have to assume that I'm interesting and I'm smart enough and I'm all of these things. I'm gonna go knock on that door. And I had to get over my own anxieties of, you know, am I fill in the blank enough to do that?
Yeah, Denise, I just read within the past day or two an essay by Charlene Wheelis, who you may know. She was the longtime CCO of Bechtel. She's now the chair of the, she has her own firm now, but also is the chair of the Page Society. And she was talking about how important it is sometimes to just speak up. And she was describing when she got appointed CCO of her company, she had a conversation with one of the other executives and said, why did it take so long for me to get this position? And he said, well, Charlene, we didn't know you were interested. You never really spoke about a desire to do that. And so when those discussions would come up, we didn't think that was something you were aspiring to. And she said it really sort of set off a light bulb in her head. I think sometimes you just need to have those conversations. And as I read that, I was thinking about this panel, because I was thinking, yes, you need to have those, but also that executive, with all due respect, and I don't know who she was talking about, but that person should have been asking and thinking about. I mean, the real sponsor and the real ally is not waiting for you to express that and not waiting to hear that. And what I would say is, to address the point that you made, Alicia, some of the best mentoring and sponsorships I've had have been with people who in the org chart were levels below me, because they were helping me to understand in different points. In fact, one of them just popped up on the chat screen here earlier, Katrin O'Sullivan, who worked with me and I think you're now her boss. But
we are colleagues, and I love her.
Okay. Well, when she first worked with me, which was a number of years ago now, she was still relatively junior, but she had done a lot of thinking about and studying and working on and activity in social media. And this was when social media was just really beginning to take off. And she was incredibly helpful to me in thinking about how I should look at various parts of social media and how I should help our firm think about that. When I was in Asia, my reverse mentors were the people that ran our digital business in China and India, and both for different reasons. But for that person in China, they have a completely different ecosystem in their social media because they banned much of the Western social media. And I did not know that ecosystem. And now all of a sudden I was running a region in which China was the biggest part. And this gentleman, Joe Pang, who's still there with that firm, was incredibly valuable. And the same with the young woman in India who happened to come from Myanmar, where businesses were just starting to re-enter. And so she was invaluable, not only with helping me understand what was happening in the digital space in India, but also how to be thinking about our business in relation to Myanmar. And so, and I've got many other examples of that. There are so many ways in which if you're open to it, and if you are truly an ally, not only can you help and should you help and be looking for ways to help and expand the opportunities for those individuals, but they can help you in immeasurable ways as well.
Yeah, I would agree. Just one sort of last question I'd love to get, each of you to talk a little bit about is, if somebody's really interested in becoming a much more active ally, right? What are some steps that people can do? Like, what would you suggest somebody do if they're interested in just really demonstrating themselves as more of an ally to groups that they may sit outside of, particularly groups that may be more marginalized?
Yeah, I think the first thing is get more specific. And so if you say, you know what, I really want to help, and which is, fantastic. And then to say, where's your passion? I want to help with, in education, or I want to help within my company around, making sure that we're more inclusive. I think the more specific that we can get where our passion lies, the better it is. If it's, for instance, at work, and I want to be a better ally. There's some things that every day these things happen. It's when whether it's someone that's Black, Hispanic, female, maybe in a Zoom meeting, and the person says something and no one even acknowledges the comment. And it's going back and saying, you know what, Karen or Carol or whoever it is, Danny actually said that 5 minutes ago. Or, well, let's go back to, I don't think Danny's point was being heard. And those are things that we could easily do. And here's another thing. We know that, let's just take meetings and continue with that, is that you're on Zoom, there's 8 people on Zoom, and 3 people aren't saying a darn thing. And it's not okay. That's not okay. So, an inclusive environment says, you know what, Bob, I see that you haven't said anything. So it's taking those steps. And when something, these are like easy things, right? Something that happens that's said that's inappropriate, saying something. And usually, who hasn't been trained on microaggressions, on unconscious bias? And we know where that training, ultimately the success is to actually do something. So when we're on one-on-one situations and that snide comment is made about that person's hair or the way that they dress, or what they I don't like, they tend to be like way too aggressive, they seem angry, right? Those are opportunities to step in and say, gosh, what, that doesn't sound that doesn't sound right for these reasons. Like, that makes me uncomfortable. And, so there's so many things that we can do that are small things that if we all did them, they'd be huge. And then there are things that we could take on that are big things that, if we can take one step forward, it would be great.
And all those points are fantastic. The only thing I would add, Alicia, as we get closer here, is just don't make it about you. So if you're thinking about how can I position myself as more of an ally, stop trying to position yourself and just do it. Right. And I think Alicia just hit on several things. Sometimes, especially with young professionals or now students, and maybe they're first generation, or they themselves. We have a number of students in Florida that have moved from Venezuela for reasons you can probably imagine. But we have a lot of other international students. So they're in a country that they're not familiar with. They're not with their family. They're learning. They're doing their college degree in a language other than their first language, and sometimes they just feel a little shy about speaking up. And it's amazing how far it goes if you just say, if you remember to so-and-so, Alicia, you made that point in a paper that you handed in for me. Would you build on that point? And first of all, I can tell you that they feel gratified that you remembered a point they made in their paper, or that I remember calling out somebody for something they posted on social media. And then I saw later in that day that she was posting something about how I had seen her tweet or something. But it builds confidence. And there's so many different things that that are involved in making that person feel ready to spread their wings. And they just need to have, not permission, but show that they have the, that they have as much right in it and that they belong as much as everybody else, and their point of view is at least as important as everybody else in that room. And many times, to Denise's point, more valuable, because it's not the same old thing that everybody else has been saying.
Right. I definitely do agree with you there. And I just want to wrap by saying, I think you both have done a tremendous job of sharing what that looks like in the workplace, for sure. I will also add that we can step up as allies in our personal lives as well. The community where I live, we're dealing with an issue in the schools where we're seeing some isms rear their ugly head. And the challenge is, besides my dog barking in the back.
No, that dog's doing affirmations like, yes, right.
Yes.
You tell him, Mom.
Yes,
Absolutely.
tell him about it. The challenge really has been that it's a race issue, but only the Black families have spoken up. And where we've, one of the things that we've said is how powerful would it be to have families who are non-Black speaking up on some of these issues, and how much further would that take the dialogue? And I think, we'd be amazed at how powerful our voices
Absolutely.
are when we decide to actually speak up and advocate for things for folks that may not look like us or may not completely describe like us, whether that's in our professional lives, but also in our personal lives too.
Oh, it's critical because, as you know, for someone that is white, I mean, we do have privilege, right? We don't have the same, concerns and frightening thoughts for our sons, or our kids, or for ourselves. And so I just think, as a society, that, I just feel like we have the responsibility, if we want a world and a society that's going to be better, for our children, then, I struggle sometimes to, why aren't we taking these steps? But that's a whole nother show.
Yeah. Jamia, we want to make sure, thank you both for being such good sports. So Jamia, I know you want to get into some of the Q&A from some of the attendees. You're mute.
I was still muted. Yes, this has been wonderful. Thank you all so very much. I mean, just some amazing points and some real actionable items that we can take, and some steps that we can take to become allies for other groups, and also for ourselves as well, our own group. So I know, Denise, you answered a few of the questions that were in the Q&A box already. So no, thank you so much for that. But I know that there was one question that came up in case everyone else was able to see it. I think you did share, either I shared the link, but someone asked the question, what changes did J&J actually make? You want to answer that live?
Yeah, sure. So, Johnson & Johnson has a credo, and, some people are familiar with it. And I've seen, I worked at J&J until I retired for 14 years. And I really think that the company takes that credo and puts it in action. So if we look at everything from employee resource groups to development of individuals, to clinical trials, to Alex Skorsky's like an incredible CEO. He's very outspoken, and he's very active, and I've seen that. And I've seen also just increasingly the representation the diverse representation, across the organization. I also, so I think it's this thing, it's action. And what I've also appreciated too is that J&J was, among the first companies to, for many of these social injustices, they have a voice, and they're using that voice. And I really appreciate that. And the reason I could tell, you know, or someone could see in terms of the genuineness of it, that we see so many people respond that work at the company that say my company. They have a genuine, you know, pride in that. And you know, as a you know, a shareholder and as a former employee, that makes me feel that makes me feel good. And that you know, is there still so much to be accomplished? Of course. I also put a link into a company that I'm also very inspired with what they've done in the healthcare space. It's Boston Scientific. If you go to their website, they publish all their diversity data. And you know what? That's what it's going to take. And so I'm a firm believer that transparency is critical. That is it about, you know, people in seats? Yes, right? Is it about how many African-American women are in the vice president above? You know, how many Hispanic, how many LGBTQ? Because if we don't see ourselves, it's very difficult, right, to get there. So I'm a big believer, and I applaud those companies that put their numbers out there and make commitments and, you know, follow up on those commitments. And, you know, if people get a chance to see what Boston Scientific, and I don't have a stake in, you know, in that company, but, you know, I also have a lot of respect for what they're doing.
Absolutely. No, that's great. And I will put that in the chat as well, so everyone can make sure they have that link. Patrick, this is a question for you. Someone said that you mentioned that the Business Roundtable's pronouncement last year, and they said, looking at the Business Roundtable's membership, many think of it as the ultimate in a performative action. For example, if you were looking at the lobbying efforts, if they're lobbying efforts, excuse me, and many BRT members, they are often at odds with their pronouncement. How do communications professionals, who often have to be the tip of the spear in these external efforts, square that?
Sure, and that's part of what I'm getting some feedback here. That's part of what the discussion was when they came out with that. And what I would say is, the notion of the role of corporations in societies, which in fact I would recommend to folks that they look at there was a special section in the New York Times this past weekend in which they were looking back 50 years when the Nobel laureate Milton Friedman said that the only role of management in these corporations is getting return for shareholders, and if you're doing anything else, it's a malpractice essentially. And they talk a little bit there, but also in recent years, and especially accelerated after the financial meltdown in 2008 and 2009, when we saw so much. You know what happened in that period. Companies have been going back and taking a closer look, and others are looking also at what the full purpose of these corporations is. And you'll find that many more corporations now, in addition to their financial reports, are filing reports on their corporate sustainability and on their corporate responsibility and on their purpose. And in 2017, there was a remarkable initiative by of all people, the CEO of BlackRock, the biggest private equity firm in the world, in which his name is Lawrence Fink, sent a note to all of the companies they invested in and said, we need to know more. If you want us to invest in you, we need to see more than just what your financial returns are. We need to see what you're doing with your other stakeholders and with the planet. And he's had some follow-up since then. And then the Business Roundtable thing happened last year. So what I would say to that person is, let's see. If all there is that statement they put out, then yes, that was just performative BS. But I think, you know, what they didn't do, for example, was start immediately the CEOs that went out and did that, including, I would say, Denise, Alex Gormley, who was very active in that and the rollout of that. They didn't go out and cut their pay immediately, and they didn't really take immediate steps to address some of the other issues that are underlying here. But I think it was a start. And I think when we have those statements of commitment, and this applies in general, but also to the things we're talking about here today, then their stakeholders, their employees, their suppliers, their customers, the communities where they operate, and yes, their financial investors need to hold them to those commitments. And obviously they're being tested a lot this year. And I would say, since I called out Alex Gormley, I think the way J&J has pursued the vaccine they're working on, the way they've communicated about it, the commitments they've made to some remarkable investments in that, in that way beyond whether they even know that's going to get approved, and the proactive effort to say we're not going to yield to political pressure and we're going to do this. We got to hold them to that now, but I don't think you would have seen some of that activity 15, 20, 25 years ago. They're, you know, in some cases, their investors would have been, creaming them. So we'll see. But I think in that and in many other ways, what we need to do here is, to the point many people have made, make this summer not just a moment that's just like the moment, back in the 60s or whatever, but actually make this real now and make this a sustained commitment that I think that there's a lot more opportunity to hold those corporations to that.
Absolutely.
I just want to add to that from a comms perspective too. I think that comms people have an obligation and a responsibility to ensure that, we get to hold the pen, but to ensure that we are not just being performative. We need to ensure that we're going back to the business and encouraging the business to step up to live up to those broad proclamations, so that it's not just performative. So that, because that's where the rubber meets the road. If we're saying these things, it's up to us, I think, as strategic communications professionals, to ensure that we've got the meat and the mots to back up the words that we're saying. And short of that, we're not doing our jobs if we're not pushing the business and our leaders to ensure that they're delivering on these broad public announcements.
Yes, and holding your teams and your managers and your agencies and your, there's a lot that you have some control over, that a lot more than you might think.
Absolutely. It's so interesting. That was literally a question that I was going to ask. Someone asked about what can professional communicators do? So you all hit the nail on the head with that one. I know we have a couple of other minutes. So there is a question, two other questions that are here. So there's one regarding how can we push to make sure that there's some diversity when it comes to ESL employees, even, for example, like being on Zoom, and how can we push platforms like Zoom to provide automated closed captions? So, thinking of other diverse groups as well. And also, how can we ensure that diversity includes people with disabilities, for example? So does either one of you all that may want to take that particular question, and we'll have one more after this.
Well, I think what we can do is push companies and push the suppliers, yes, but also companies that are using them to do that. And I think that's a very good example, for example, as we're all ending up on Zoom or one of the platforms, because it's not just Zoom. And then I would say there's a tremendous organization, NOD, the National Organization on Disabilities, that's doing a lot of work on identifying what needs to be done in workplaces, because it's way beyond what people used to think was sufficient. And so I would say look at what some of their initiatives are and support those. And I think the other thing I would add on that latter point is we need to remember that there's an increasing recognition that, especially in times where we're all existing in a sea of anxiety and stress, where when we talk about disabilities, we need to be thinking also about emotional and psychological health, as well as mental health issues, as well as physical health.
Great point, Pat, absolutely. And then the last question before we close out is, someone asked a question about working in an area of the country where racial and ethnic diversity is limited. Their DEI committee has found that conservative staff are at least most outspoken about feeling discriminated against or not included in the organization. The person wants to know, do you all have any thoughts on how a human service agency that tends to lean left can better support those staff and others to feel included and important?
So the question is how to help staff in general or staff that are conservative. I misunderstood.
Yeah, it seems like, this person is saying that their committee has found that conservative staff are the least outspoken about feeling discriminated against or not included within the organization. So they were wondering, do you have any thoughts on how they can, an agency that tends to lean more left can better support those staff and help others feel included and important?
Well, Denise, I don't know if you have a thought on that, but Alicia, were you going to make a point?
I was just going to say, I do find it interesting in this, current world that we're in, that those that lean right tend to get closed out and squeezed out and not have a voice. I think it's important for us to hear voices across the board, regardless whether we agree or disagree. 50, 75 years ago, some of the more left-leaning perspectives would not have been welcome in the room, and which has certainly driven us to where we are today. I don't think that we get to a better place by not allowing conservative voices at the table or in the room. I do think we have to balance that with people's rights, human dignity. There's still free speech. The challenge comes in when free speech starts to trample on people's rights or becomes disrespectful. I don't think it's ever to anybody's advantage to not allow a diverse opinion at the table, even if that opinion is, no matter what that opinion is. So I think we all have an obligation to be open to hear perspectives, the spectrum of perspectives at any conversation, at any table. Organizations will lean left, right, or center, but it just doesn't mean that if you have a divergent point of view that you should not be heard out and shouldn't be welcome to speak up in those rooms.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I think that's true. And also, the flip side, if we find ourselves, which might be what that comment was, in a situation where maybe people aren't being as inclusive and that there's a group that maybe is, going one way. And I would say at some point, when things do cross the line and, we may have to elevate that within an organization. And that may be something like, to me, where lines are crossed, if I can use COVID right now, it's when people go in the store and they don't wear a mask, right? Like, that's just wrong. And so, you may have a different opinion, you may whatever, but we have, depending on where you're at in the country, we have a responsibility to each other, and some of that's mandated by states. And so I think the same with conversations, that there has to be mutual respect, even when we disagree, but we have to look after each other.
Mm-hmm. That's what allyship is all about. Well, thank you all so very much. This was wonderful. We look forward to getting this is recorded. I know a few people they were asking if this was going to be recorded, so it is. You will be receiving a post-webinar survey along with the video link and some additional resources with actionable steps that you can take to become an ally. So thank you again, Alicia, Denise, Pat, for your time, your passion and commitment to diversity and inclusion. And thank you to all of our attendees for being a part of it. Again, a huge thank you to the New Jersey State YMCA State Alliance for your support and sponsorship of these courageous conversations. Look forward to seeing you all at the next one when we talk about building and retaining diverse teams. So be on the lookout for information about that, and have a wonderful day. Thank you again so much,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone. Thanks.
Bye-bye.